Hello.
You're going to have to be called to order.
Order, please. Member of the committee. Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming out on this very cold and blustery evening. My name's Sue, and I'm going to be chairing this talk this evening. And a very warm welcome to everybody. The Morning Star Readers and Supporters Group are hosting this talk on Is China Socialist? We'll be hearing from two speakers, Twm and Keith, who will be talking about their visit to China. Keith and Twm will speak for around 15 to 20 minutes, very strict on that. And there will be a question and answer session where we will aim to finish at 8:30. We'll hear from Twm first, who is a member of the Young Communist League and the Communist Party and sits on both the Central and Welsh committees. Followed by Keith Barrett, co-founder of Friends of Socialist China. Keith studied Chinese history and politics at London's University, School of Oriental and African Studies, and first visited China in 1981. Friends of Socialist China is an organisation dedicated to supporting the People's Republic of China, providing a counter-narrative to Western media and promoting an understanding of Chinese socialism. Keith is also the co-editor of People's China at 75, which are available to purchase. Twm will lead first.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you firstly to Sue for agreeing to chair this evening, and also Keith for travelling down from London as well to join us for this talk. So I was fortunate enough to go to, I suppose first of all I was fortunate enough to be sitting next to Keith at Welsh Congress about 15 months ago now. I was talking about Cuba and Keith was talking about China. And I said to Keith, I wouldn't mind visiting China. And a few months later, I had an email asking if I'd like to join a delegation. So, yeah, I mean, China's always fascinated me. And I've always wondered, why are we always told that, like, China is a threat to the West? So I guess when I had the chance to see what this threat was, I thought, yeah, definitely. So, obviously, the title of the event tonight is China Socialist, so we should explore that. So there are many topics I could talk about this evening, but I know Sue will be on to me if I don't stick within my time. So I'm going to talk about a few, sort of personal experiences when I was there, what really, stood out to me. So as most people know, China, has a population of around 1.4 billion. One of the first things, it didn't at any point feel like you were cramped, you were unsafe when you were there. And I think it was quite clear that so many of the buildings and the outdoor spaces were built sort of like with convenience in mind and, to serve the people as well. I have got some photos I'm going to put up as I go along just for people to see. But this is a train station we were at. Usually is absolutely massive, and then this is one of the streets in Xi'an as well. So there were trees planted everywhere, and this is by design. So yeah, I think one thing that really stood out to me is how clean it was. You didn't have litter sort of everywhere, you didn't have chewing gum stuck to the floor. I think the other thing is, when we were there, the delegation, we pulled off quite a good few drinking sessions. We see in the early mornings the cleaners out cleaning the streets, but there was a sort of like a sense of pride keeping the place clean and things. I think also what stood out to me was how friendly the Chinese people were, and also how proud they were of what China had achieved, but also their understanding of the history of China. So when we were there, we visited the Great Wall of China. So that's a couple of photos when we visited. And we visited in the evening, and as you can see, there were lots of animations on there. And I'll be honest, at first, I did think it was actually quite tacky to see all of these everywhere. But actually, as we were, sort of going along, they were explaining It was a history of China, and it was promoted towards Chinese tourism, so it wasn't, you know, for the West to come and things. It was very much for Chinese tourists. It was telling the history, and it was all free whilst we were there as well. And I think, you know, yeah, as we were going around, there were a number of families with their kids interacting, so it, you know, it was for everyone, you know, and they made a point of that. And I think this is like one of the biggest contrasts I saw between China and Britain, is how they preserve their history and how it's accessible to everyone in public spaces. So, I mean, just last week I was watching a film that Beth Winter had been part of, which is The Cold Beneath Our Feet, The Wind Above Our Heads, and there were two school children being interviewed as part of that, and they didn't know the history of like Tower Colliery, which is just down the road, and it only closed in 2008. You know, and this is in comparison. We visited one place, which is Duhang in the Gansu province, and whilst we were there, it was Dragon Boat Festival. So these are some photos when we were there, and we attended. So this is in the sand dunes, and you can see. No, you can't actually, but they used the sand dunes opposite to project sort of like the words of songs and things for people to, you know, join in with and something. But yeah, it was incredible, and we actually climbed to the top of the sand dunes, and it was so hard, but it was also the best beer I've ever had when I got to the top. You know, and the view was something else. But yeah, at this event there were around 10,000 people, as you can see in this image here. You know, all those people there. And again, it didn't cost us anything to attend. And I asked one of the locals, you know, like, what was the event, like, what were they celebrating? And they were able to explain, you know, it was an ancient story and a tradition. And they also even had videos available on WeChat, which is the equivalent of WhatsApp, you know, which gave a brief history as to, you know, what the event was about. Don't ask me, because I can't remember or tell you what that event was. But I think, you know, this isn't, you know, just a one-off example of free spaces, because we also visited in Duhang a printing press, which here is a photo. At first it looked just like a really simple cafe, but actually when we went downstairs, this is what we saw. You know, all these were stamps that you could use, you know, and it just, yeah, it was available for everyone. And I went a bit crazy when I was there. Did that, so my creative side came out, and that cost me nothing to do. So the whole point, you know, these spaces are available for everyone to use and join in, and it, you know, it's reminding them of the history whilst they're there. Another thing, you know, they planted trees by design. So there are a number of initiatives by the Communist Party of China, you know, to plant trees to increase the forest coverage. Sometimes you hear it referred to as the Great Green Wall, and it serves multiple purposes. So, you know, obviously it's helping with the CO2 emissions, but it also is preventing the spread of sandstorms and things like that. And one place we visited was, if I can say this correctly, Jiaoguan, which was in the desert. So it was a city in the desert which had 42% green coverage. So I think what was really impressive about that was seeing that no place was getting left behind. And whilst we were there in Duhang, we also visited the salt tower plant. So this here, they had 12,000 of these solar panels, making it one of the biggest solar panel sites in the world. And it gets fed into the electric grid. It's a source of reliable, you know, energy and things like that going forward. And whilst we were there, we were joined by a university teacher who had lived in Jiaoguan all his life, and he was explaining the changes he'd seen over the last 30 years. And he mentioned, you know, his salary had increased 40 times, which is just incredible. And we were asking him, you know, how does this make you feel, the things you've seen, and what have you? And he said, you know, he was very proud and satisfied, and he just felt, you know, everyone is, sort of achieving this and things. And, what he showed is they all understand the goal of like common prosperity and things like that, having a better life for everyone. And that brings me on to, I don't know how I'm doing for time, but
Fine.
yeah, okay. But it brings me on to one of the final points I want to talk about, which is how China deal with like contradictions and common prosperity. And we can see this, in China are doing so many things that we are not, and it's like, why are they doing that? And the point is, they want to give everyone in China a better life. When you just think back to 1949, from the founding of the PRC, they were a peasant country where famine was a yearly thing. It happened every year, to now lifting 800 million people out of extreme poverty. And they set to do that by 2021 even, sorry. But they actually did it, in 2020, so a year before their goal. And it tied in with the founding of the CPC, which is the Communist Party of China, which was 1921. And these statistics, they're not, from Chinese-run institutes. This is the World Bank that, are sharing these facts and figures. And I think, in terms of contradictions, China, they did have a period of industrialization, which did mean, there was a cost to the environment as a result. But I think there's sort of two questions really to think about, ask yourself when we're looking at this is, what were they trying to achieve? And then I think quite commonly when we look at China, it's been the last 70 or so years, we're quite quick to forget actually, Britain went through its own industrialization, and as if we're, perfect and have never contributed, but actually we still do to this day. So in terms of, what were China trying to achieve during that time when they were industrializing is, they tackled poverty, they tackled illiteracy, and they built up a health service which, actually functions and deals with this is all in the aftermath of a civil war and imperialist powers interfering in China. Whereas if we look at Wales, literacy rates are actually going down, and 31% of children in Wales live in poverty, and 26% of those are actually in working households. And our taxpayers' money is all going on this ever-increasing defence budget. So, China and the CPC, when they're dealing with those, they were weighing up, what's the main issue here? And it was to lift people out of extreme poverty. And they've done that. They've absolutely done that. And that's not to say though that they're doing nothing now to tackle the climate impact. I talked about a few of the initiatives already that they were doing, and actually in the last couple of years is showing that the CO2 emissions in China, are either trending, at level, and I think it's this year now is actually started to go down. So they're producing less CO2 than, producing less than emitting. They're doing good stuff basically. So their target, for this was to peak the CO2 emissions by 2030. So actually they're like 4 or 5 years ahead of their target. And I think the point of this is these are tangible outcomes that demonstrate, they put their words into actions. So often we hear about we're going to do this or we're going to do that, but they're actually proving it with actions what they're doing. And I think this is sort of also emphasised by Xi Jinping, so the General Secretary of the CPC. He said we must strike a balance between economic growth and environmental protection, and we will be more conscientious in promoting green, circular and low carbon development, and we will never again seek economic growth at the cost of the environment. And that was evident when we were there, in some of the workplaces with the national grids. They were, explaining that they're going to have 52% of their energy come from renewable sources in the next 5 years, or at the end of the current 5-year plan. So the question is, why I suppose can China do this? And it's because rather than capital ruling the people like it does here, in China the people rule the capital, so they can invest in infrastructure, in renewable energy, and raise people out of poverty. So I guess going back to the question, is China socialist? I'd probably say so, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you now, Keith.
Right,
Thank
thanks very much, and yeah, I'm very pleased to be down here. It's actually my second time in this club. The first time was in the margins of the Welsh Communist Party Congress that Twm mentioned, and it was great to listen to Twm's talk. It brought back some memories of the trip we had together in May and June of last year. I want to focus more on another trip I made to China last year, a few months later, in early September, and that was for the 80th anniversary of what they called the victory of the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression and the global anti-fascist war. Now, sometimes the Chinese like quite long formulations. That's what we know as World War II. So that's a longer version of saying it, but it actually defines the character of the war, both in terms of what was experienced directly by the Chinese people, and what the global significance of it was. I'll say a little bit more about that later. Now, the centrepiece of these celebrations was a huge military parade, which was obviously, some of that got shown on the TV here and so on. And there was a new and formidable and very impressive range of weaponry that was put on display. But I make no claim to military expertise of any kind, so I just had to take what people told me. What I would say is that the what the event did most, I think it demonstrated two things really, besides the fact that China was becoming a militarily powerful country. It showed the what I would call an ongoing and rapidly developing realignment of international politics was on display there, and also the atmospherics of the day, I would say something about the character of Chinese society, with conclusions similar to what Twm was saying. Now, this was a big event. Obviously, there were 29 foreign heads of state visiting. There were people from dozens of other countries. There were tens of thousands of people assembled for the parade. So, it took a lot of organising, to put it mildly. And one of the things that meant was that there was a very early start to the day. The parade was at 9 o'clock in the morning, and we had our first security check leaving our hotel just after 5 in the morning. But we were told that we were lucky. We were one of the latest groups to be cleared. And I have a friend from Hong Kong who was also up, and he was put up in another hotel, and he rang me the night before, and he says, "What time are you leaving your hotel in the morning?" I said, 5. He said, "Oh, you're lucky." But there was Western press stuff I read in later. The Sky News people were complaining that they had to be in the square for their first security check at 11 o'clock the previous night, which I'm sure that was deliberate to make them suffer the most. And, judging by some of the rubbish they report, they definitely deserved that kind of punishment. But obviously, there was tight security, as you would expect for anything like this in any country in the world. We went through 3 lots of checkpoints, but it all functioned seamlessly, and although it was like tight security, it was very unobtrusive. Everybody who was on security was making it very clear that they were there to help you. I would imagine there were people with weapons at somewhere in the vicinity, but nobody actually dealing with the members of the public and visitors on dealing with security. None of them were carrying weapons at all, and so it didn't have that kind of atmosphere. What you did have every few yards, because obviously, again, with such huge numbers, you had to park, some way away from the assembly point. So there was quite a journey from being dropped off your bus to get there. And the whole route, literally every few yards, maybe like between here and that back door, 3 people. There were these young student volunteers all along, and every one of them, as you walked past, smiled, said hello, and they were just there to help with with whatever anybody needed, and in that way they could seamlessly assemble without without making it seem like any trouble at all, which means obviously an awful lot of trouble was gone to, but an audience of 50,000 people was seamlessly assembled. We were all issued with a little red bag, not a little red book this time, a little red bag, which had basically everything you would want for that. A plastic Mac if it rained, water, energy drink, sun hat, and of course a little flag to wave. What would be the point of a parade without a flag to wave? In terms of who was there on the level of international politics, it's first of all that the day before the military parade there'd been the summit meeting of a body called the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation, which is something that started out a quarter of a century before with 5 members, but now that was China and Russia and the Central Asian republics, and now with the additions of India and Pakistan and Iran, and with observer members, they've got a total of members and observer members is now 27 countries representing about half of the world. So how does the Trump administration deal with the SCO? Because as with the BRICS, you have here in BRICS and the SCO, you have 2 major international bodies which embrace half the world or more, and which not only does the United States not dominate, but neither the United States nor any other imperialist power are even members or observers. In other words, these are forums where the global majority meet and engage on their own terms. Of course, notwithstanding the class character of many of the participating countries, many of which are very far from socialist, or the issues and problems that exist between a number of them. But you had, for example, there, for the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation, you had the Indian Prime Minister who was making his first visit to China in 7 years. And you have done, I said there were some, I said 29 earlier, that was a slip of the tongue. There were 26 heads of state and government who were present in China on September the 3rd. Others who've been at the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation, some of them didn't stay, like the Indian Prime Minister and the Turkish President. So all of the socialist countries were represented there by their heads of state, which I think was the first time that there was such a gathering since long before the fall of the Soviet Union. And obviously one of the things that was very sort of eye-catching, one of the things that was very much promoted in the international media was that the 2 principal guests were Putin, the president of Russia, and Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, which was presented as something of an international sensation. And even amongst a crowd of Chinese people, you could feel a kind of a sort of a buzz of kind of excitement or interest at seeing this particular lineup. And obviously in the Western press this was presented as some kind of deliberate snub or insult to the West to highlight things in this way. And perhaps it was to some extent, but I think it's really a sort of an exercise in self-centeredness for people in the West to think that that's all that it is, because what you have particularly now in China is and growing throughout the global south is the idea that the Western powers are not the centre of the world, and not everything is done in response to them, but is done rather according to people's own agendas. Obviously, China and the Soviet Union were the key protagonists on the main fronts of World War II, which is not to negate or belittle the contributions of anyone else, but it was China and the Soviet Union and their peoples that bore the brunt of the conflict and made the greatest national sacrifice to save humanity and civilization from slavery and barbarism. And China not only made the greatest national sacrifice alongside the Soviet Union, the war in China started earliest and lasted longer. First of all, when the Japanese seized the three northeast provinces of China in 1931, and in 1937 they launched a full-scale invasion of the whole of China. So that's why the Chinese people, as I mentioned earlier, defined this as, first of all, a Chinese people's war of resistance against Japanese aggression, and then also as the global anti-fascist war. Now, again, for the centering of Korea in those celebrations, Korea became a Japanese colony in 1910, and it was the present leader of North Korea, his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, had fought in northeast China alongside the Chinese communists and other Chinese patriots from the early 1930s. So, I mean, briefly, among the other leaders were the 5 Central Asian states of the former Soviet Union, Mongolia, also Belarus, Armenia and Azerbaijan, which meant that 9 out of the 15 former republics of the Soviet Union were represented by their heads of state. Same for 6 of the 10 members of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And Li Jingjing, who's some of you may know of her, particularly if you follow social media. She's a young woman journalist on Chinese television, but has a very big following on social media. And I think she put it very well. She said, the Western powers always claim that China is quarrelling or threatening its neighbours. She said, but all our neighbours came to celebrate together with us, and there's a very obvious contrast here, with particularly the present Trump administration in the United States, with what it's doing with regard to Canada, Greenland, Colombia, Mexico, and of course above all Cuba and Venezuela. And if as the leaders of the West were absent from Beijing, the only country that's a member of the European Union and NATO that was represented at the top level was Slovakia. But that's not because they weren't invited. It was them who chose not to be. And I think this is part of the current Western revisionism that we see, where the liberators of the Nazi death camps are excluded from the commemorations, for example, of the liberation of Auschwitz, whereas the state that perpetrated the genocide, Germany, and today's state, Israel, that's carrying out a genocide, become honoured guests. And we have an increasing trend in the European Union that puts an equal sign between communism and fascism, but which is actually meant to not actually to put an equal sign between communism and fascism, as outrageous as that would be, but is actually to rehabilitate fascism in the service of anti-communism. And we see obviously like the outlawing now of communist parties and even communist symbols in the Czech Republic, Poland and the Balkan states, and very similar pattern in Japan with the election of a far-right prime minister who seeks to overturn the peace constitution and has declared that any conflict concerning the Chinese island of Taiwan could prompt Japan to enter. So that's why Trump on September the 3rd issued one of his bitter, deranged tweets where he said, "May President Xi and the wonderful people of China have a great and lasting day of celebration. Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America. And then he added, the big question to be answered is whether or not President Xi of China will mention the massive amount of support and blood that the United States of America gave to China in order to help it to secure its freedom from a very unfriendly foreign invader. Now, the reality is that China does fully acknowledge the United States' contribution, be it the Flying Tigers, the US volunteer pilots who flew across very dangerous and treacherous terrain from Burma to supply the Chinese armed forces, the Dixie mission, which was the American military mission that went to the communist base area of Yan'an, which Tom and I visited last year, and of course the People's Solidarity in the United States with Paul Robeson singing what became China's national anthem in English and Chinese. But the last one is probably something that a racist like Trump might be less keen to remember. So what I would say is that who was there and who was not there tells a story in itself. And that is that the fundamental division of the world that was analysed by Lenin early in the 20th century at the formation of the Communist International into oppressor and oppressed nations still remains basically valid. Or to put it another way, we're always told that that for a country that China is, sometimes they'll say, is isolated in the international community. Now that only makes sense if you actually define the international community as being the small handful of big capitalist powers, or as Tony Benn used to say, I've met half the international community because I've met Tony Blair and Robin Cook. So so that, and I think that in that that new world that's emerging, every country has its part to play in this, but politically and economically, and as seen in the parade, increasingly militarily as well. It's Socialist China, I think, is becoming what I would call the indispensable nation, borrowed the term from Madeleine Albright, but I'm applying it in a different way, in driving what Xi Jinping frequently refers to as changes unseen in a century. And I think that the working out of those changes, with all their challenges and so on, is the real significance of the events that took place in China marking the 80th anniversary of the war.
Thank you.
Did I stick to time?
Perfect, yes.
Amazing.
1 minute under. Thank you both very much. This is very interesting.